Well, good morning and welcome to The Law Show here on AM 650. Personal injury lawyers Joe Murphy and Brian Brook, from Murphy Battista in studio. Joe Murphy, good to see you again.
Good morning, Sterling.
Nice to have you back with us. Tell us what's going on these days at Murphy Battista.
Well, our newest addition is a beautiful black lab.
Okay.
This lab has graduated from UBC Law School recently.
I see.
He was a seeing eye dog for a blind student who went through UBC Law School.
Okay.
So this dog literally sat through every lecture you needed to sit through in order to graduate.
I see.
Tragically, this dog is now losing his sight.
Really?
So he's retired as a guide dog. But retired guide dogs are interesting because they have to be with people all the time or they get very anxious.
I bet.
So he is with someone in our office all the time.
I see.
Usually sleeping under someone's desk.
So you've taken him on, have you?
And because he's a service dog, the building lets him in the building because their rule otherwise is no dogs.
Of course, of course.
So he's our latest member of the firm.
I wanted to talk a little bit. I wanted to get you to tell us a little bit, and then we'll meet Brian. But I want to talk a little bit about the Spinal Cord Injury of BC, the group that you are partnering with legally. Tell us about that arrangement, Joe, please.
We work with this wonderful organization that is designed, and its mandate is to help people with spinal cord injuries. Spinal cord injuries happen in a whole bunch of different ways. Car accidents, motorcycle accidents, biking accidents, falls,
Yes.
industrial accidents. And the people with spinal cord injuries are often left without a lot of resources, particularly if they live outside the Vancouver area.
Okay.
So the organization looks to provide support to them wherever they are. They've got offices throughout the province, and they look at helping them with housing issues, with accessibility issues, with jobs, vocational, and do a wonderful job. We have, for the last 20 years, worked with that organization at providing them with legal help.
Okay.
And we've acted for dozens of people who've had spinal cord injuries because oftentimes there's a lawsuit that arises when you have that. If you have an industrial accident and have a spinal cord injury, there usually isn't anything but the WorkSafe or WCB benefits.
Well, there are procedures,
but
right?
otherwise, there's often someone whose negligence caused the tragic accident.
Mm-hmm.
So we've spent a lot of time working with people, paraplegics, quadriplegics, hemiplegics. There's all sorts of combinations of deficits. But the more you work with these people, the more you get to understand what they're living with day in and day out.
Our other guest today on The Law Show is Brian Brook from Murphy Battista. Brian, how long have you been with Joe's firm?
I've been with Murphy Battista for about 13 years now, since I think July 2001.
Have you always, as is the case with Mr. Murphy, always wanted to practice personal injury law?
Yeah, my dad was a lawyer when I was a kid, and I always wanted to sort of follow in his footsteps because it seemed like an interesting profession and one that was challenging.
And what sort of law did he do?
Everything. He was a small town lawyer, so he was the city solicitor, he did some family stuff, he did some criminal stuff, and he did some personal injury stuff.
Okay.
A bit of a jack of all trades.
Sure.
I decided in my later years that I wanted to go to law school to be a lawyer like my dad in some respects, but to really focus in on doing personal injury.
And what drew you to that particular field, Brian?
I didn't think I was smart enough to get into medical school, and I figured doing personal injury work was an easy way to get close to dealing with medical stuff without an actual doctoral designation. I've always been fascinated by the way our brains operate, the way our brains, the way we see ourselves impacts the way we interact with reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought that dealing with an area of law that focused in on how people come out of significant head injuries would be challenging, interesting, and fun.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in short snippet why I got into this line of work.
Well, medical malpractice, though, Joe, is a part of what you do at Murphy Battista because you are a personal injury law firm and people do get injured, sometimes by accident, by medical professionals, don't they?
Yeah, Sterling, that's correct, but most personal injury firms do not do medical malpractice claims because they deal with an injury, but otherwise they're quite different than say a car accident claim.
Sure, sure.
So there's just a handful of firms in the province that do a lot of medical malpractice cases, and you have to do a lot of them to, I think, get pretty good at them. They're very, very challenging because there's always the issue of whether the doctor or the hospital or the nurse was negligent.
Right.
And they're tough cases.
And pretty aggressively defended from the other side, too.
Very aggressively defended.
Okay. Brian, I wanted, because you've expressed already a certain degree of fascination with the workings of the human brain. Talk to us a little bit, if you would, please, as a personal injury professional. Tell us about the difference between brain injuries, Brian, and spinal cord injuries.
Sure. I mean, the first and obvious difference, Sterling, is you can tell when someone's sustained a spinal cord injury.
True.
They're in a wheelchair and they're largely or partially immobile, whether they're quadriplegic or paraplegic. People they bump into in day-to-day life are going to recognize them immediately as being somebody with an obvious disability.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to accommodate that person with an upfront understanding that some of this person's ability to function is going to be compromised by virtue of their injury.
Right.
People with head injuries are often...
but that person, I'm sorry, just to finish that thought off, though, that person in the wheelchair may well indeed be physically disabled, but are likely to be 100% there mentally.
Absolutely.
Okay.
A person with a head injury often is going to be what we call walking wounded. In other words, this is somebody who you could sit down with and chat with, and you would say, this person doesn't appear to be injured at all.
Right.
You're going to treat them as though they're intact because they look normal, they sound normal, they often have an intact sense of humor, they can string a conversation together without obvious impairment. And it's only when you really spend a lot of time or see that person respond to stress or an unhappy, significantly sort of adverse situation that you realize that there's something not quite right there.
Right.
The problem with the way we deal with people with head injuries is precisely because they don't appear or come across as though they're head injured. They look absolutely normal. They sound normal. And it's often a surprise for people to realize that, there's something beyond what we see, that veneer of normalcy that is impaired.
Right. And I suppose, Joe, in some cases, if you have a client who Brian has just described as having suffered some trauma and has a brain injury, but doesn't look or sound or appear like they have any injury, and in some cases probably is in a pretty acute case of denial that there's anything wrong with them.
Yeah, it's not denial, it's a lack of insight. So when I meet with the brain injured client at the first meeting and I say to them, how are you or how are you doing? I expect them to say, I'm fine, I'm doing well.
Right.
We always get them to come in with a husband, wife, mother, father, brother, and you watch the reaction of the person they're with, and there's a little bit of a wince because this other person, the friend or relative, knows they're not fine, but in their own mind they are, and it's a lack of insight rather than denial. Over time, they have to recognize things are different, and over time denial is often there to make it easy for them or easier for them to function and retain some self-esteem.
But that's why that second person in the initial interview is, from a lawyer's perspective, really a benefit, Brian, because you're able, if the person who is injured is going to say, oh, I'm fine, come on, then you look at the person he or she came with and they're kind of giving you, not really. And you count on that. Do you expect the person to sort of say, oh, I'm fine, I don't know what this is all about?
It depends. Every case is different. Every person's different. The way people respond to tragedies and injuries is idiosyncratic. It varies from person to person. Generally, having another set of objective eyes there in the initial interview stage is critical because you're not going to get the full picture from somebody who's got a significant head injury.
Right.
They're not going to be able to see how they're different. It's the analogy I use, Sterling, is this. You take a gentleman who's wearing glasses and you scratch the lens of the front of the glasses and you put them on, and the guy who's wearing the glasses is going to realize there's something off with his vision. he's not going to know what the heck is causing his vision to be off, but he's going to know that there's something wrong there.
Sure.
It only takes, I mean, you really need to be an outside observer to look there and say, yeah, well, Jim, you got a big scratch in your glasses.
That's right, yeah.
Our ability to use our brains to understand sort of subjectively why we're off, why we're not seeing things correct. It's precisely the brain that's impaired that makes it impossible for us to recognize that.
Right.
You need a third party to really help put things in perspective and to help, the lawyer understand why things are off and not as rosy as they may be.
And Joe, for that first meeting is, you and I have been doing this for a fair bit now, is that first conference, finding out where you stand legally, find out what your options are, is that initial meeting still free?
Oh, yes, yeah. The first meeting is for we, the lawyers, to find out about their case and about them.
It's a two-way street, isn't it?
Them to find out about us.
Right.
And there are some cases where we say to people, listen, there's no lawsuit here. There's no claim here that we can succeed in. And there's other people that say, well, we don't want you to act for us. We never hear back from them. Mm-hmm. But the first meeting, I think, is so important because it's that first touch. I had a woman phone me once, Sterling, and say, I'd like to make an appointment to come in with my husband. And I said, okay. And she described him as having a brain injury from an accident.
Okay.
And then she brought this up. She said, you've got to promise not to ask me if he's different since this injury. And I said, and why is that? She said, because he flies into a rage whenever I talk about him being different or having these problems. And I said, did he do that before this accident? She said, of course not. He was fine, but now he flies into a rage if I point out things that are different. Mm-hmm. So that was useful for me to know, but it really magnified the reality that he was either had no insight or was in denial. And she was saying, oh, my God, things are so different. This is a different person.
So when you had that initial conversation with this individual, with her husband, having been tipped off that if you ask a direct question about his well-being, he might flip his lid. So how do you get around that?
He didn't flip his lid. He said everything was pretty good. It was fine.
Oh.
Whenever they have a brain injury, they also have other injuries. You don't get a brain injury and not have a back injury, neck injury,
sure, right.
Maybe some fractured bones. So there's always something else that's part of the package. But the person with the brain injury generally sees in the early stage, which can go months and early years, that they're fine. They're not different. And that's what's interesting about a brain injury is if I have a client with a knee injury, they're the best person in the world to tell me what's wrong with the knee and how it hurts and when it hurts.
Yep.
But if I have a client with a brain injury, it's the significant other people in their life that are best at describing what's different because they just can't. The brain injury simply takes away their ability to understand that something's changed.
Right. And in some cases, Brian, you were saying in examples that you've had, we were having a coffee before we went on the air this morning, and you were talking about people who, because of the brain injury, lose their ability to filter their thoughts. As we normally do in conversation, we might want to say something and we go, no, perhaps not. And we say something infinitely more civilized. And people with brain injuries can't do that.
Well, I mean, the thing I've learned over the course of working with brain injury survivors is no two people come out exactly alike.
Right.
There are all sorts of subtle differences, but yeah, absolutely. One of the hallmarks of a significant frontal lobe injury is an inability to regulate or filter what's coming out, what you're saying, how you're reacting to situations. A lot of the behaviors that come out and the words that come out are simply inappropriate.
Right.
They're not fitted to the situation.
Almost a Tourette's kind of thing there.
Absolutely.
And that's uncontrollable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. I want to talk to you. We'll take a quick break here. When we come back, I want to talk about getting your life back. Our guests are Brian Brook and Joe Murphy from Murphy Battista, LLP, downtown Vancouver at 650 West Georgia Street. And we'll continue with The Law Show after this quick time out here on AM 650.